All right, welcome back to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality. More than skin deep, I'm your host, Enzi, and y'all, I'm back this week with Graie Hagens, and we are going to be talking a little bit about intersectionality, um, as well as it relates to the Colorado Springs shooting. So, Graie, welcome back to the podcast.
I mean, thank you for having me back. At some point, we got to find some language for being like, I'm so glad to be talking to you again, except always the circumstances. That or we got to find some times to record some more joyfully circumstanced conversations between the two of us.
I mean, we have a lot of stuff we could talk about related to Black liberation, so
Facts. Got to get into that imagination station.
yeah, yeah. I think that's our way forward, anyhow.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Yeah. I spend a lot of time not watching the news, not being on Facebook, and so I realized that I have been really out of touch, and I mean, and that's with everything, like music and everything, and it also means that I'm not always up to date on all the latest details. Um, Related to anything really, but particularly in relation to this. And um, Gray filled me in on some stuff that was like, huh, interesting. Like as we were talking about doing this and really thinking about identity and how that impacts how we see things. And so, um, Gray, I'm gonna actually have you kind of. We're talking about the person being non-binary, but I'm gonna kind of have you talk about that for a little bit, if that's okay. Um, or just the facts, or however you want to. It don't have to be just the facts, sure.
I don't want to be responsible for the facts, so I'm gonna go ahead and give that caveat. Is I don't want to be responsible for the facts, and partially I do watch a fair amount of news. And when I say news, I watch particularly, I watch a lot of Fox News, especially in the evening. I like to kind of catch that lineup and I intersperse it with some CNN, MSNBC, but kind of the mainstream news. I like to watch that. And particularly when you talk about kind of like identity and stories, it's so much about is the creation of a worldview and the reaffirmation of a worldview. And for me, it's like the majority of Americans, the majority of the other people who are trying to figure out what is their individual and what is our collective story right now, get their news from these kinds of sources. And so I pay a lot of attention to kind of what's the story that's being crafted there. And I don't put too much weight, honestly, or I don't know if it's good or not, on their ability to name the facts. And so I certainly don't want to hold the responsibility for the facts. So what I can do though is kind of share a little bit about like what am I hearing and understanding about this story from the way that I'm watching it play out, right? And that is um, one to name that we are in. There's some times in we'll call it America. There's some like weeks and some stretches of time that feel heavier than others, and this was one of those weeks. Kind of the weekend, hearing the news about the shooting in Colorado, and a couple days later, hearing about the shooting in Virginia at the Walmart. Just to name a couple of moments that definitely for me gave me pause, right? Brought me back to a place of fear, quite honestly, of kind of being out and being in public in the world. And so I say that first and foremost to say is that we're at a moment where people uh, are afraid, and we're on this continuity of fear right now, where it seems like we're kind of always afraid, but we have these moments where it feels reinvigorated or reaffirmed. And that is definitely for me being felt differently, right? Like right now, as a queer person, as a trans person, there's a different way that I feel that kind of fear and that kind of sense of threat. Because we also know that the shooting happened, right, lined up with Trans Day of Remembrance, which even in the name of that gives us space to know that we have to carve out space to actually even remember ourselves, remember our siblings, remember our people, both because we are structurally not remembered, but also I think for so many of us, knowing both the expectation of short life Also is how do we hold on to our stories? How do we let our existences become a part of the worldview that ideally collectively we could start to hold, and a worldview that actually is about all of us, right? I started to hear initially about the shooting that I initially started to hear the story about the shooting was about anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, and that the shooter was connected, by family to kind of a right-wing conservative politician. And within a couple of days, watching Tucker Carlson, I start to hear actually as a part of the shooter's defense that they actually are non-binary and use the pronouns they, them. And that started to come out as a part of the official defense and from the lawyers. And so then having this moment of being like not only afraid, but we're back in this moment of some of the confusing tension about fear and ways that identity gets tricky for us, right? Where I think sometimes we still want our fears to line up with more clear-cut stories, right? We want to be able to differentiate between ourselves and the tiger, for instance, right?
Mhm.
One of the things you and I, kind of share some interest and passion for is thinking about like polyvagal theory, for instance. And I think so much about polyvagal theory and that teaching that like story follows state, right? That once we are triggered, we start to very quickly fill in a set of stories that are oftentimes pre-scripted for us, right? Or that are kind of socially, historically designed for us about what and who we should be afraid of. And so we're in this moment where both increased fear about right-wing violence. And so when we hear things, there's a section of us that are more queued up to be afraid of that. And then also hearing that the shooter might actually be a member of our own community, right? And the fear then that gets queued up and the skewing and the confusion of the story when it's not so clear cut, when I can't tell if the tiger is just out there. And like, how do we hold some more of the complications of intercommunal violence, right? When we're in such an overwhelming, what feels like ongoing onslaught of external violence, right? You've reminded me over and over again, Herschel Walker the next day started to run anti-trans ads as a part of his campaign for the runoff in Georgia, right? That this is a place of real political contestment and legitimacy as a part of what we call quote unquote the culture wars right now that are happening. We're watching particularly trans panic, whether it is like fear of trans folks as groomers for children, because also reading that the bar was supposed to be hosting like a drag brunch the next day, that this whole fear about our relationships to children, but also that we are by nature morally destructive, to the fundamental kind of patriarchal Christian nuclear family, white supremacist, et cetera, project. And this story of both being internally and externally threatened it feels like it's a lot to hold to be like, and so for me, that is where I'm kind of understanding the story right now and thinking about like, well, yeah, again, what does that mean about Ford? About what do we do with that? And there's lots of other facts that I'm sure are relevant to the case.
Yeah, I mean, and I one of the things that for me in order to look at forward is always also looking at where have we seen this before, um, and for me, I'm a '90s kid, right? So I always go back to that time, and just been very mindful of, in many ways, the ways in which we became desensitized, uh, again and again and again, but particularly in the '90s to black pain, black death, and black suffering was um, it's black on black crime. Then it kind of um, the like it delegitimizes. Is that a real word?
I think that's a
Okay.
great word.
So it delegitimizes the pain and the violence. But we do know that whether it's looking at the Torah, like wherever we look at it, we know that as humans, we are prone to be violent towards those closest to us. If the first murder was Cain and Abel, um, that tells us that that means we are capable, at the bare minimum, of causing pain to those. I mean, most of us, the most pain we cause is to ourselves, and so how can we not uh, cause pain to others.
I mean, that feels real. And it also brought back to me this part of like, there's definitely an out by the right around this narrative, right? And it's similar kind of way of black on black crime. And I actually appreciate that as like as a good parallel narrative in that kind of way, right? Because and I'm not a historian of this, but I imagine somebody has blessedly done this work, right? Of like, I have no question that you could probably do some solid media analysis about the development of that as a narrative and what that has actually done. I'm sure that it tracks, right? And some of it is what it does around if the shooter in this case, again, is actually a member of our own community. It gives the right a cover for their own transphobia and homophobia, et cetera, right? Because they get to say, actually, clearly, it ain't us doing it. And, it gets to also kind of delegitimize kind of the internalized experience of oppression that we damn well know exists, right? And it also gets, of course, delegitimize kind of their own role in stoking the flames. It gets to that kind of hate speech, right? But it also makes it excusable because it's like, oh, well, y'all do this to your own selves. So why should we care about it if you all do this? See, you all are the kind of morally destructive beings that we thought you were. So there becomes this almost like propelling or fulfilling kind of element of the narrative. And again, that's as we get more activated, as we get triggered around things, there are playbooks and stories that get filled in that kind of way. And so I appreciate that as an example. And also again, sitting with that, well, what do we do with that? Like we talk a lot about and thinking about kind of our role as organizers and political educators, or even just in our own beings, right? Like the requirement for reimagining and renegotiating the contract and what it means to just be us in our bodies and figure out how to have joy in that. Like knowing enough about our own lives and come from to know that we didn't exactly come out of sunshine and rainbows. Right? Like coming out of realities and existences that themselves are complicated and were inflected by that very violence, right? And so both Holden being like black on black crime that's a political narrative, and there is a experience of violence that has to be figured out.
Yeah, I mean that is one of the things as well, right? Like when we talk about the right being implicated in this, it is the reminder as well that Colorado Springs is the home of Focus on a Family, and during James Dobson's heyday, I guess, if we want to call that. Maybe it wasn't his heyday, but the turn of the century. That was my evangelical days. That was the days when I was um, trying to be someone else that I was not. I was trying to not be a lesbian, and I'm not a lesbian anymore. So, in many ways, that was successful. But I'm very much gay, so there's that. But really thinking about the impact of Focus on a Family and um, really the impact of self hate that goes so deep, um, that can cause folks to do violence, not just to themselves but to others. And to be clear, I'm talking about this in a larger context because this is a larger context thing. This is um, the pain of the victim's loss is there. We don't want to delegitimize this, and want to make it clear that this is a consistent pattern um, that occurs, and in many ways, I would say, even as a part of the fabric of our nation, whether it's to one group or another, but this consistent pattern of violence, of hate, of a nation that I suppose right became two by in multiple ways, but one by violently taking the land from folks that was already here. Two, by violently kidnapping Africans and bringing them here. most groups that came over as white were fleeing violence from other white folks. Like, how can violence not be the fabric of who we are? And how do we shift that narrative, and not just shift the narrative? If it's the fabric, then maybe there's institutional pieces of it. And look, I believe in many ways this experiment failed, and I don't see it being dismantled anytime soon. And so, if that is the case, and if we have what we have right now, how do you make how do you make joy out of suffering, right? Like, we talk about making lemonade out of lemons, but really, how do you make joy out of suffering? How do you I don't eat pork, and right, how do you make chitlins out of pig intestines, right? Like a meal that is a delicacy for um many, and thankful for that, because um I don't want to be in many people's houses that are cleaning them. But really, how do you make something out of nothing, right? How do you make $1 out of 15 cents, as our ancestor Tupac? Um, I don't know if he's the first one that said that, but for me, that's who said it. So.
There you go. I think there's so much that is coming up for me right now, as it often does when we talk. It's about remembering always that we're in lineage. And I don't mean lineage in terms of linear or chronological, but that we are actually in lineage, meaning that we are in lineage, we're an imagination lineage, right? And for you and I, part of that means that that's the lineage of midrashists and rabbis and communities that figured out how to maintain and express Judaism from the moment of getting to the other side of the sea forward. That means being in the lineage of folks who survived
Mm-hmm.
being kidnapped, the transformation from being people, and that personhood meant something outside of a European imagination, and were transformed through the European project of creating the concept of man, also created the concept of savage, of chattel slave, of etc. Right? But people who not just survived all of that, but imagined our ways out of that to become not just bare minimum level of respectable human, right? But said that there shall be no weapon formed against me, right? That there shall be no hall of power that shall be, I shall be held out of. Right? That we are in the lineage of people who have broken the contract of cis hetero patriarchal Christian gender and actually said, oh, there's something both deeply beautiful that I want to embrace about the messiness of Black masculinity, but also I'm not gonna be the versions of that have harmed me throughout my life as best as I can be. And so I think there's something about being even in our own lineage of choosing, of finding what is most available to us and being able to practice into that. And I feel like the older I get, honestly, the more I understand this political experiment of the United States that way in some ways. And not to, maybe I'm overly projecting, maybe I'm whatever, but I deserve to have that in my 35 years of Black trans Jewish life in the United States. I get to have some you know what? Some of this has been the trying to figure out and stumble forward. And so there are weeks like this and moments like this that are about how do we integrate and make sense, because forward is the way I'd like us to choose. And there are things about, we know that there are certain directions of forward that we actually do know what they bring us. They take us back in a way that we don't want to go. They take us to a version in which we don't live that long. They take us into, but there's something about leaning into that practice of imagining, and it is understanding, right? That kind of, again, in the lineage, that there is a lineage that's been constructed for us. It's not the totality of lineage, but we have more of that. And so we got to learn to more practice away from that. But we don't got to completely disavow. How can we? Right? Like I can't be here and find joy in who I am if I completely act as if where I've come from is for me at least. I can't completely separate myself out of that, right? And I say that also as a person who has new ancestors, right? Like thinking about even my relationship to my parents, kind of being in this place of their first yard sites and being like, how do I understand love and relationship and all of that kind of stuff, and being able to say like they were exactly the people they were, and it has not done me a favor in life to act as if they were not, but it also is not doing me a favor in life and the person I want to be and accessing the joy I want to access if I have to completely disavow all of it. And I don't want to replicate the struggle and then I don't want it on nobody else, right? But it also has something to do with who I am, right? Like there's some things only grow in the mud. That is just real. And I ain't trying to say I'm not trying to get back in the mud, but like beautiful things come out the mud too. And we can't act like, the mud it's nutrient rich.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I think there's some about like, yeah, being able to hold that and being able to hold that, even the way you and I have talked about kind of again this week and this holiday that we grew up being taught was called Thanksgiving. And there's all kinds of work about thinking, reimagining and thinking about how do we hold that? Because we can't just act like it don't exist. That would be, we live in a world now in the United States that's so constructed around us that this day means something. And we're trying to figure out how do we both re-understand and retell the story so that, again, it is actually honoring, first and foremost, the people for whom's literal lives that story is against, right? From indigenous folks who both saw their land taken away, but also their lives completely destroyed, watched numerous numbers of people be murdered. So now have this fluffy story. And it means something to be Black in this country and observe a holiday like this. It's a different kind of Black family holiday that is not about the nationalist kind of patriotic expression. It's something about being able to actually have structured moments of rest and joy with family. And it's like we got to figure out how to, again, tell the truth and still be able to access all the things. We can't keep actually again, the things I've learned, and sometimes the most hard way, is the truth can't keep breaking us down this way, actually, right? Like, or we got to figure out how to process it better so that it's becoming more nutrient rich. Because we got to get flowers out here blooming. It ain't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. First off, may both of their memories be for a blessing.
Oh man, thank you. But even in that, I think there's something about that practice of saying, may their memory be for a blessing, to say that, again, that's a gift and a technology we have in this lineage of Judaism, right? And that did me tremendous gifts. I think, honestly, like when my father passed, I didn't know what to say. I was like, I could say lots of bad things. And also at the end of the day, was like, that's my father. And I loved him for no other reason sometimes other than he was just my dad, and our brains are actually kind of structured that way. You know what I mean? And so to have even technology in practice to just remind me, I get to choose to have some memory be a blessing in some way. And that, it means whatever it means for me. So also thinking about, how do we hold on to memories that create blessing, that create pathway forward? Because otherwise it makes sense that we continue to follow the paths that have actually been forged for us, right? Like whether or not the shooter in Colorado's gender identity is, or like, there's a pathway that is forged for them already, where there's internal, external community violence. It is they chose violence that was not, they didn't make that up. And so we have models and lineages of liberation, but liberation is going to have to be more of our choosing and imagining than the violence.
I mean, and that's a huge piece of it is thinking about one, where the choosing comes in at, and thinking about choosing in many ways. I, I don't often talk about this, but I chose Judaism, and there's something interesting about the choosing, and also something interesting about. I wouldn't necessarily say giving up a belief because I shifted, and by the time I realized I was Jewish, I did not believe in the divinity of Christ. And something about gospel music, right? Something about particularly '90s gospel music, right? Thinking of Fred Hampton, and as you said, No Weapons. Like that's the only thing that could come to my brain. Thinking about when Kirk Franklin was the first person, at least in that generation, to be on FM radio, whatever you want to be on the what is it called?
He was just on like the regular pop. He was a crossover. He had that
Yeah.
like crossover status.
But like thinking about that, and for me, there's a lot of things that I give up and gave up, especially because of yeah, I get rid of the things that cause us harm, and sometimes it can be hard. But a lot of things I gave up, and for a long time, some of that was gospel music, but it wasn't really gospel music. It was actually Christian music, which is very different. Um, and I I don't think about this often. One of my um, high school colleagues, I say colleagues, he was a senior when I was a freshman, but we also went to church together. It's recently been doing some reflecting, and one of the things he said was reflecting on how we went to a predominantly white conservative church together, but it was us. We were the black folks that were doing different things, and he told a story about something that happened, and he said that was the first time we learned to be small in white spaces. Um, and so, like for me, thinking about that time, sometimes I just um, it seems like so much of my time and gospel music. There's something about gospel music that's more about the Torah than about the Newer Testament. Um, that makes it such an easy joy to return to. Um, and also, I suppose once you're secure in who you are, it becomes much easier to do those things. But really thinking about how do we, how, this project of liberation, right? This piece of moving forward. How do we do that as well as making it even better? Like, how do we improve upon what we have? Uh, because in many ways, that's is that I think that's our assignment.
I like thinking about what our assignment is, right? Like to me, there's something about that that feels very Jewish about that. Just being like, what is the assignment? Hashem, what am I supposed to be doing? But I'm also struck by the frame of improvement, right? And for me, it goes back to I could give a whole testimony about being in church spaces and learning to be small around white folks. Oh, child. And growing up, like seeing Kirk Franklin at Six Flags and feeling really disconnected. And gospel music didn't feel connected to me until after I converted to Judaism. And it's been interesting right now for me is I'm coming back also to kind of thinking more broadly about reggae music as well, which I also, particularly because of, my father, I definitely skewed away from for a long time, and then found myself embracing, kind of in undergrad in those moments when, we do those things. But more recently, right, just going back and thinking about how close in tone, both in terms of expression and connection and kind of Old Testament stories and that similar set of feelings, right? But it brings me to some sense of like, even like there's some that kind of idea of improvement. And, I like music and I make playlists all day long and I like different kinds of genres of music and I like to play with music. And it brings me to there's some things that like some things ain't like the original. Like there's some level of like, it ain't no improvement. It's finding place to be in relationship. And so I don't mean to oversimplify this, but when I like think about when I make a playlist, for instance, right? And I've been making playlists with some different tones as of late. I've made some playlists that are trying to reconnect with some music that I found deeply connective to when I was younger, right? In moments of life that were incredibly hard for me, and music that now feels incredibly politically wrong and feels like if I actually sit down with the lyrics, real, oh my, oh, woo, do I care about me? And also held incredible space for me in moments that I needed it. And I don't need a remake of that stuff. I don't ever want to go back to being 15, 16, but I do want to be able to sit and listen to my little secret, like Eminem's most violent lyrics playlist.
I mean, we talked about. Look, the first song I listened to this morning was "Never Would Have Made It," and it's that reality that there's some music that,
Mm-hmm.
as a little suicidal black girl in the
Mm-hmm.
'90s,
Yes.
um, Eminem got me through some stuff.
Yes.
I'm glad I did not cuss right there. Anywho, Eminem got
Good
me through
job.
some. Eminem got me through some stuff though. Like
Yes.
we have to be honest that like 97, 98, there was not going to be any more new Tupac music.
No.
And so it got me through. It wasn't just Eminem, right? It was Wu Tang
Lincoln Park.
and that's at a well, and here's the thing: is we're four and a half, 5 years apart, and so the
Yep.
other piece is
Yep.
the place in time, which is also an interesting thing, and I want to name that. I know that we kind of shifted into this liberation talk, which is important, and um, because this is where we want to go. Is really how do we make joy out of no meaning, but also that understanding that joy is that much sweeter when what you came from is not that great. It's we have the ability to understand that a little bit of something when
Mhm.
it's not. Or as a person with chronic pain, when I have no pain, like it's not even that I'm feeling good, it's that I have no pain, and I'm like, oh, what's happening? Like this feels incredible. And I can appreciate not being in pain when that's the case, because it's um and I also would not wish that on anybody. Like not at all. But I would forever be bitter at the "it gets better" movement, and thinking about one of my colleagues, friends, ancestors, elders, um, ended up completing suicide during that time period. And before that time, I kept saying, "Y'all, we need to pay attention to our elders." And this was what, almost a decade ago, I think. Time is really weird, but this was a while ago, and so I was much younger, but really concerned and wanted us to pay attention to that. Um, and for some of us, it does get better for some folks, and for some folks, it doesn't necessarily. And how do we create a world in which, not which this happens less, because that's what we want to do. That's obviously what we want to do. And how do we create a world in which um, everyone find themselves loved, in a world where the worst part of us isn't that we hate a piece of who we are, and so we harm others that are like us, um, but that we can find the joy in another person, right? Like um, I don't know what type of song it is, the Christian song that says that the Jesus in me sees the Jesus in you, but like really thinking in the context of uh, can the joy in me see the joy in you, um, and how do we capitalize on that in a way that allows us to heal.
Yeah. It's the language of B'Tselem Elohim, right? Being made in the reflection or the image of the divine. And it makes me think of a handful of things, like particularly thinking about like the um, you asked that question earlier about what's the assignment. And if I understand or I have any kind of central principle of being B'Tselem Elohim, I'm made in the image of the divine just as you are. it changes kind of the relationship to what the assignment is, right? And it both changes not just the relationship, but also kind of the scaffolding of the assignment to kind of use kind of, curricular development and teacher language, right? It means that we have to re-understand both what the product and the process is. And some of that is we got to understand that sometimes we're the villain in the story. Just like, right, it's hard to read Torah, as we oftentimes do together, or as I, we get the blessing of having Black Trans Torah Club of all things, right? Sometimes Hashem feels like the villain, right? Sometimes, you're someone's bitter taste in their mouth, just like there are. And also it's remembering like nothing is actually stagnant. Like many things actually are sometimes. And for me, that takes me back also, like, as a person who has struggled with kind of like life-ending ideation at different times, right? Like we know the utility of being able to reground and remember actually that like nothing is stagnant, that there is actually possibility of change. And for me, that just kind of again reaffirms for me, right? Like how do we continue to build movements that not just center the labor or the useful utility of those closest to the pain, etc., but actually honors the visionary possibility and the learned praxis. You know what I'm saying? Because if you want to really learn from somebody how to get through something, you go learn at the feet of somebody who done been through something. And so for me, it becomes a moment of being like, oh, right. Like I thought at some point I was cis and or straight. I tried to do that. And then there was a period where I thought I was a lesbian and I tried to do that. Right. And I didn't have to dismantle anything or disavow anything to actually find myself. Right. I think is what I've understood at the end of the day. Now, don't get me wrong. On the pathway from here to there have certainly been moments of that path in which was what was presented to me were those moments. Sometimes I took the bait, sometimes I didn't, right? But I get to be a person enough to be able to honor all of those moments. And also, like, as my daddy would say, I got it honest. I'm a Gemini sun sign. My Chiron is also there. So my unhealable wound, again, got it real honest. I'm hard-headed as that deal, right? Like, I want to go fuck around and find out. I did cuss. I don't know if that's allowable on
He's
this
gonna
podcast.
take it out, so that's fine.
You can fool around. You can fool around and find out, right? I can be a fool around and find out person sometimes. And so part of my own learning to like love and be healed in myself is remembering sometimes having to say like, oh, I am B'Tselem Elohim, just like you are. Right. And I got to do that in relationship to myself. I got to do that in relationship to Hashem. I got to do that in relationship to people that I love without question. I got to do that to people that I love with deep challenge. I got to do that with people I could give a flippy flop about sometimes. Right. But again, finding myself in right lineage is remembering that I have that practice and I'm in the lineage of other people who have some of that practice to be able to say, right, like we fall down, but we get up. Right, to be able to say
and
like
that's even more complex, right? Like that is that's Donnie McClurkin, right? So Donnie McClurkin was the first time I knew that it was wrong to be gay. He did a concert at our convention, at our youth convention, and that like I was so little, and I pray for his healing. Because the pain of being someone you're not is like I think about when you said you didn't have to change. You said you didn't have to. I don't know if you said change or do anything, but I just keep thinking of like my decision. You said you didn't have to give up anything, and when I decided to, when I realized that I was going to leave the ex-gay stuff and that I couldn't do it anymore, it wasn't a decision to give that up. It was actually my decision to choose life, like that. And that, like I remember before I left and making my saying that I'm leaving, I remember I said I have to choose life, y'all. And this is not,
yes,
that's not it.
yes. And I think so much of that for me is thinking about, again, I don't want dismantling anything to be my priority. And that's something I've honestly, I think, learned from my own experience and evolution and healing and learning to deeply love um myself as a trans person. It brought me to understand the expansiveness of it. Not just that it was like a transition was not a single event, right? And there was so much story for me about, you just do the thing and then blah, right? Like, or these moments that felt like bump in the road or little here's choice points, as opposed to, again, a lineage, a flow, sometimes a wave, but coming to the place of having to finally realize, like, oh, dismantling patriarchy is not my primary goal, right? In the same way, like, dismantling white supremacy is not my primary goal,
Right.
right? Like, and some of that is like kind of just embodied experience that I don't know that I would have really understood from reading it somewhere. I had to have the moments of actually sometimes feeling some, like, gender euphoria to understand, like, oh, actually, the more expansive, the more grounded I feel, the more free and liberated I feel. And it really came from not having to disavow anything. I didn't, not having to say, like, oh, that's too feminine or that's too masculine, or having to stop trying to perform some kind of a balance and actually, again, just sit down with the whatever. I'm made in the image of the divine, and that is big and that is expansive. And it just how, the Hashem that I know in Torah can appear as all kinds of things. I get to be in that as well. So I think there's so much about, it's embrace. Again, it's remembering, like, none of us are fully formed. We're all becoming. We have neurological developmental science about that. We got all kinds of, you know what I'm saying? And again, remembering I can't be a queer trans person in this country and act as if I haven't had to perform and embrace things that did not serve me and that also harmed other people in part of my, like, becoming. And so, like, if I get to be full and still love me at the end of the day, which I struggle with, but also firmly do believe I deserve and is my divine right, that is also true for all the other people. Now, that gets to be boundary as well. Being B'Tselem Elohim does not mean that you get to just do as you please to be. But it does mean that I can try to be in a lineage of practice that does say, like, no, you are made from the same spark of divinity. You are in the same wave, and you are being molded. And just like a wave, sometimes may that wave, as as our brother Koach would say, may that wave carry you the furthest distance away from me. But may you also be loved in that distance. Now, I don't want distance to be reaffirmed by a carceral state, by borders and boundaries that then dictate hierarchy of humans. And also, again, part of the project, though, is how do we be together, like, in the most simplest and complex ways, in a way that says, actually, your humanity does not infringe on my humanity. Like, that's a period. It does not take away. And I do think there's so much about just how do we that there's more to it than dismantling. It's just, what new are you practicing? Where did you find joy in a place you didn't even know it was possible? It's going back and making a playlist of a bunch of Chance the Rapper stuff, because I was like, Black Boy Joy is a real and beautiful thing. Like, there is something about that energy, and I don't need to dismantle or disavow anything to just enjoy that as fully as possible and hold that is my divine right. And also, none of that changes that I also was a very suicidal little Black girl, right? Like, those are all things, and that those things actually are mutually healing. The joy feels more joyful, and also those moments of, like, deep hurt and suffering, it doesn't make them worth it, but it gives them their space to say, like, oh, what a full experience of humanity, and what a joy it is, actually, as as the Reverend Dr. James Cone would say, like, to be able to tell the truth in front of white folks, also what to be able to live bold, and not have those moments of being terrified also define my future, being able to love on myself. Can you imagine? Like, we even let those moments where we got far away from ourselves completely take away all this big, beautiful joy. Like,
Man,
no.
that's the we're gonna get ready to wrap up because we could keep going and going, but I think that's it, right? I think it is the at one point the inability to experience joy. At one point the like I'm about to be 39, and I say this over and over again. I I never thought I would make it past 18, and I'm not sure necessarily all the time why. We could go a lot of things about that, but um, but it's that joy, right? And I've spoken a lot before about my journey, and especially as I found out more about who I am, particularly about being autistic. It shifted so much. So I'm not gonna go into too much detail. So because we could talk about this another day, but Gray, I really appreciate you for coming on. Do you have anything you want to say before we end up?
I think the one final thing I would say is, it's a thing I yearn for in movement spaces, and I'm not always very good about it, and it's one of the things that further fuels my yearning, is more stories about the choosing, about choosing life, choosing love. I think so much about, for instance, kind of the movement for Black Lives, both organizationally but more broadly, or Black Lives Matter, or movements that are so deeply rooted in loving Black folks and loving all of us. And that is a vision that came from and was articulated by Black folks who had been explicitly marginalized from previous iterations of movements, or who had been made small in those stories, or who had been left out, right? Seeing a movement led by Black women and Black queer folks and Black trans folks, and a little bit still seeing the way like Black trans mask folks still feel like we're not visible in the story. But again, it being like, oh, we actually do again have lineage and example of not perfect, not, but what it looks like, and how do we kind of sometimes err away from, and I'm definitely guilty or have observed this in myself quite frequently, of that like desire to critique and dismantle, as opposed to say what beauty there is of these moments of movement, right? How beautiful it is that we have moments of Torah in which all of us, as we are taught in our lineage, all of our souls were present at Mount Sinai. Whether you converted, whether you're patrilineal, matrilineal, whatever, that we may have a tradition that privileges a certain kind of lineage, a certain kind of, we also have moments that also tell us all of us were present at that moment. All of us were there to receive Torah. All of us are legitimate. All of us are B'Tselem Elohim. And how do we hold on to that with enough confidence and security? And there's things that need to happen for us to certainly feel that kind of confidence and security, but that can be so held so close that we can move through all the other moments, the moments where the story gets more complicated, where there's a surprise. Well, actually, so and so turned out, that we can actually just have moments again that just say like, yes, and also all of us were there in those moments. And again, how do we hold we do know sometimes what it looks like. We have had moments of touching joy, and it ain't fair that we ain't had enough. It ain't fair that we still in the struggle. It ain't fair, it ain't fair, it ain't fair. And yet here we are, and we exist, and it's more than for raising tensions. It's more than just for resistance. It is beautiful for its own sake, period. And that is divine and holy. And we'll continue to figure out, like, also, what is the assignment, though?
No. Again, thank you so much. Y'all, thanks again for listening to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality. More than skin deep. I'm your host, Enzi. Next time. Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality. More than just skin deep is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast.